Welcome to Sunday School Lesson at a Glance, a ministry of the Sunday School Publishing Board, where we focus on teaching, engaging, application, and learning for teachers and students.
I will be sharing highlights and key points from the Adult Faith Pathway Bible Studies Sunday School book and the Townsend Press Sunday School Commentary based on the International Lesson Series. This week's lesson continues our spring quarter of Sunday School lessons. The title of this quarter study is Jesus Calls Us. The biblical thread of the spring quarter connects Jesus' earthly ministry as exhibited in passages from all four Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John to the birth of the church following Jesus' death, resurrection, and ascension as seen in passages from the book of Acts. Unit 1, the unit that we are finishing up, is entitled Called from the Margins of Society. The lessons in this unit highlight accounts where Jesus disregards artificial societal barriers, choosing instead to reach people on the margins. This week's lesson is Lesson 4, the last lesson in Unit 1, and is from the Gospel of Mark and explores Jesus' healing of a man possessed by a legion of demons. Get your Sunday school book, Bible, notepad, pen, or device, and follow along as we take a glimpse into this week's Sunday school lesson. Now let's get started with this wonderful lesson. The lesson title for this week, March the 26th, is One with a Mental Illness. And this is the title in the adult book. The title in the Sunday school commentary is Jesus Overpowers Legion. The background scripture is Mark chapter 5, verses 1 through 20, and Luke chapter 8, verses 26 through 39. The print passage is Mark chapter 5, verses 1 through 13, and verses 18 through 20. The key verse in this week's lesson is, the man went away and began to tell in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and all the people were amazed. And that's Mark chapter 5, verse 20, the New International Version. Here are 3 questions to consider and reflect on as we go through this week's lesson. Question number 1. What was the condition of the man with the unclean spirit in this week's lesson? Question number 2. When the demons saw Jesus, what did they say and why? Number 3. What did Jesus command the demoniac man to do after he was healed and set free from the demons? This week's lesson is in the book of Mark. The Gospel of Mark is identified as the shortest gospel and was probably the first gospel written. Approximately 90% of its material also occurs in Matthew, Luke, or both. Mark, also known as John Mark, was not one of the 12 disciples. However, he is the author of the Gospel of Mark. He wrote the Gospel of Mark, which is based on the testimony of Peter and the early church fathers. John Mark was a companion of Barnabas and Paul and is the recognized, as I mentioned, author of the book of Mark. He accompanied Paul on his first missionary journey. Mark presents Jesus as a man on a mission to bring hope to the hopeless, help to the helpless, healing to the hurting, deliverance to the bound, and salvation to the lost. The theme of the gospel according to Mark is Jesus Christ, the servant. Mark states its focus in Mark chapter 10, verse 45, the New King James Version, which reads, For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. This focus is revealed throughout this gospel, as Mark describes Jesus as busily meeting people's spiritual and physical needs and ultimately giving his life for the whole world's sins. Mark's targeted audience was the Romans. The bulk of Mark's account focuses on Jesus' ministry in Galilee and in Jerusalem, and climaxing with his resurrection and ascension. In this week's lesson, Jesus demonstrates his power over the spiritual realm energized by Satan and his cohorts. The lesson aims for this week are: number 1, compare and contrast contemporary symptoms and consequences of mental illness with those experienced by the man in Mark's story. Lesson aim number 2, confess the ways that you or your churches misjudge or stigmatize people. And lesson aim number 3, raise awareness in the community of services available for treating mental illness. As we continue our glimpse into this week's lesson, I'm going to share 2 key points from each outline in the lesson text and expound some on each one. There are 3 outlines presented in the Adult Faith Pathway Sunday School book. The first lesson outline is a cry for help, and that's Mark chapter 5, verses 1 through 8. The second lesson outline is a command that healed, and that's Mark chapter 5, verses 9 through 13. And the third lesson outline is a commission to proclaim, and that's Mark chapter 5, verses 18 through 20. Let's begin our analysis of the biblical text with the first lesson outline, a cry for help. From Capernaum, Jesus and his disciples crossed the Sea of Galilee. A storm blew up unexpectedly, but Jesus calmed it, landing in the region of the Gadarenes. After demonstrating his power over the natural world, Jesus now demonstrates power over the spiritual world. Verse 1 reads, "They went across the lake to the region of the Gerasenes." Verse 1 records Jesus and his disciples arriving in the country of the Gadarenes, or the region of the Gerasenes. This area was located on the eastern shore of the Sea of Galilee. Verse 2 reads, "When Jesus got out of the boat, a man with an impure spirit came from the tombs to meet him. Immediately after getting out of the boat, a demon-possessed man came out from among these tombs," as we just read in verse 2. Jesus encountered a man from the tombs. This man had an evil, unclean spirit. This verse highlights not merely a maniac, but a demoniac. The demoniac is identified as the Gadarene demoniac. Having an unclean spirit means being demon-possessed. Demons do exist. They are evil spirits with malicious intent. They exist everywhere on the earth, facilitating the work of Satan. Demons are evil fallen angels who follow Satan. Evil spirits can use the human body to distort and destroy man's relationship with God. Demons are dangerous, they are powerful, and they are destructive. Key point number 1. We should avoid any curiosity about or involvement with demonic forces or the occult. James chapter 4, verse 7 reads, "Submit yourselves then to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you." The demoniac man, blood was streaming from various parts of his body where he had cut himself with a jagged or sharp stone. The man roamed the mountains and the tombs. He was howling and crying in utter despair. The demoniac man was at war with himself and with other human beings. His condition indicated that he could not live in community or live in the community. He was consigned to the tombs. The term tombs referred to cave-like rooms that were chiseled or carved out of rocks to serve as burial sites. Verse 3 reads, "This man lived in the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain." Jesus' encounter with the demoniac in the text reveals that isolation and physical restraint were common forms of dealing with the mentally ill and demon-possessed people at that time. Apparently, the community had made efforts to confine this man, but his great strength resulting from demonic possession and influence prevented the community from restraining him. He roamed the mountains and tombs day and night. He was an outcast from society, and he was uncontrollable. He was isolated and cut off from society. Verse 4 reads, "For he had often been chained, hand and foot, but he tore the chains apart and broke the irons on his feet. No one was strong enough to subdue him." In verses 3 and 4, Mark intricately describes the man's condition. He had physical strength and power and could not be restrained. The powerful demonic forces infused the man with the unusual strength to pull his chains apart and break his shackles. Verse 5 reads, "Night and day among the tombs and in the hills, he would cry out and cut himself with stones." Verse 5 describes the man as roaming the mountains and tombs day and night, emitting a continuous, unearthly scream with terrifying sounds while cutting himself with stones. Again, blood streaming from various parts of his body where he had just cut himself. The man was unrestrained and uncontrollable. What we see is what Satan does to man, or what Satan can do to man. The devil's purpose is to steal, to kill, and destroy all who are made in the image of God. We will see what Jesus will do for this man. Verse 6, "When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and fell on his knees in front of him." In verse 6, Mark shows that demonic forces immediately recognized who Jesus is. They also recognized Jesus' power, and also they recognized Jesus' authority over evil spirits. Even from afar off, the demoniac saw Jesus and ran to him. The demons paid homage to Jesus through the demoniac man by causing him to kneel in Jesus' presence. The demons understood who Jesus was. Verse 7, he shouted at the top of his voice, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? In God's name, don't torture me." For Jesus said in verse 8 to him, "Come out of this man, you impure spirit." Key point number 2. Jesus heals and restores a demon-possessed man. Jesus liberates this man. He sets him free from Satan's bondage. Addressing Jesus as the Son of the Most High God, as we just read in verse 5, was the demons' admission that they recognized Jesus as the Son of God. They knew who he was. They also recognized that he would judge them at the appointed time. They recognized Jesus' power and they recognized Jesus' authority. Paul wrote in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12, the New International Version, "For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms." Second outline, a command that healed. Verse 9 reads, "Then Jesus asked him, 'What is your name?' 'My name is Legion,' he replied, 'for we are many.'" Jesus asked the man his name, and the evil spirit replied, "Legion." According to the text, the man was filled with many demons, not just one. A legion was the largest unit of the Roman army. A Roman legion usually consisted up to 6,000 men. Key point number 1. The demoniac man was tormented and controlled by many daunting and terrifying evil spirits. Some biblical scholars note that these demonic spirits oppress the man as one combined force led by a spokesman. It is beyond our capacity to understand what this man experienced and what controlled and tormented him. The thousands of evil spirits intending to destroy his life. They were destroying his life. We see the condition that he was in. Verse 10 reads, "And he begged Jesus again and again not to send them out of the area." The demons knew they had no power over Jesus. So when they saw Jesus, again, they begged not to be sent out of the country or out of the area. Aware of Jesus' power over them, they feared him and continued to beg him to allow them to stay in the area. Verse 11 reads, "A large herd of pigs was feeding on the nearby hillside." Verse 12. The demons begged Jesus, "Send us among the pigs. Allow us to go into them." And verse 13, he gave them permission, and the impure spirits came out and went into the pigs. The herd, about 2,000 in number, rushed down the steep bank into the lake and were drowned. The demons, requested permission to possess a nearby herd of swine, and without explanation, Jesus granted their request. Doing so ended their destructive work in the man. Key point number 2. Jesus performs a miracle of compassionate grace and mercy. Jesus gave the man and those witnessing this miracle proof that demons are real and the man's deliverance was genuine. Jesus' action was also visual proof of his compassion for the souls of humanity. Verse 15 reads, "When they came to Jesus, they saw the man who had been possessed by the legion of demons sitting there, dressed and in his right mind, and they were afraid." Jesus freed the man and brought deliverance and restoration to him. He restored his mind and his outlook on life. When Jesus touched him, he was clothed and in his right mind. Jesus had compassion on the man. Third outline, a commission to proclaim. Verses 16 and 17, which are not a part of the lesson text, reads, verse 16, "Those who had seen it told the people what had happened to the demon-possessed man and told about the pigs as well." And then verse 17, "Then the people began to plead with Jesus to leave their region." And verse 18, "As Jesus was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed begged to go with him." Verse 19, "Jesus did not let him, but said, 'Go home to your own people and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you. The former demoniac, who had been demon-possessed, pleaded to accompany to go with Jesus and become one of his followers. Jesus denied the man's request and commanded him to go back to his estranged immediate family and countrymen and tell them about the great things that the Lord had done. The Most High God, what he had done for him, and how he had mercy on him, as we read in verse 19. Key point number 1. Jesus wanted the man to go back to his community and be a witness and share what Jesus did for him. By sending the man away with this good news, Jesus was expanding his ministry to people who were not Jews. He was to go back to his community, to those who knew him before, and to let them see what Jesus did in his life. A witness shares what he has seen, what he has witnessed. He was now commissioned to go where Jesus was no longer welcomed and to proclaim Jesus' marvelous grace and great power to the Gentiles. This man was so thankful for his miraculous healing that he begged Jesus to allow him to become one of his followers. Jesus refused while granting his request, but differently. Instead, he made him a follower or disciple, tasked with making other disciples among his family and also among the citizens of his country or community. Verse 20 reads, "So the man went away and began to tell in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and all the people were amazed." Key point number 2. The man obeyed Jesus, he obeyed his command, and he shared his testimony on how the Lord healed, delivered, and restored him. Many who heard his testimony were amazed, and most likely some believed in Jesus as a result of his testimony. Jesus had a sovereign purpose in mind by refusing this willing disciple's request. Jesus was no longer welcome in the area. Therefore, this man's remaining there would accomplish 2 important things regarding the offer of salvation. First, he would be living proof of what Christ can do for fallen humanity. Second, the demoniac turned disciple. He became the first missionary to the Greek civilization in the Decapolis. The man obeyed and indeed became a convincing witness of his grace and power, as we read in verse 20. In summary, in this lesson, we see the power of Christ in the transforming of a man's life from being a demoniac to a disciple. This lesson demonstrates that Jesus can help break the various kinds of chains that bind and potentially damage believers' fellowship with God. The Word of God assures us that God is greater than our crisis. Jesus has authority over everything, every force, and every person in all creation. God is concerned with our total well-being. He is attentive and interested in the things that impact us physically, emotionally, financially, mentally, and spiritually. Jesus, in this week's lesson, healed the man completely and gave him a testimony that he would share with others about the great thing that Jesus did for him. Our closing thought and question: Jesus is a chain breaker. When Jesus rose from the dead, he broke the chains of sin, death, and the power and control of the devil and Satan. Jesus can break chains and shackles that bind us physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. Our question: what specific chains or shackles need to be broken in your life? In closing, thank you for tuning in to Sunday School Lesson at a Glance. I hope this glimpse of this week's lesson is helpful to you as you prepare to teach and study God's Word. Don't forget to click the like, share, and subscribe button. For additional information and resources, contact the Sunday School Publishing Board. Blessings to you until the next Sunday School Lesson at a Glance.
We invite you to join us each week as we take a glimpse into the Sunday School lesson. Subscribe now.